The auction grounds on Varkalon Prime shimmered under the twin suns like a mirage. But what was being sold that day was no illusion. The richest elites of the galaxy had gathered under silken canopies and crystal pavilions to bid on rare, exotic, and broken creatures from fallen civilizations. Among the shackled slaves stood a woman unlike any other, Elsera, a towering figure with silver skin that bore the branding iron of 10 masters, violet eyes dulled by captivity, and the elegant stature of a warrior whose pride had not been extinguished, only buried. Her chains clinked like the sounds of a funeral procession, yet she stood without bowing, a ruin that refused to collapse. The Prince of Vordax, heir to the 4th throne of the Corinth Empire, raised his goblet and declared her his by default, smug in the belief no one would dare outbid royalty in a galactic ceremony designed to humiliate the conquered. Then, through the crowd of jeweled cowards and warlords, a single human stepped forward, a Terran soldier named Commander Jareth Kor, bloodied from a dozen battles, battle-scarred and stern-eyed, and said, "One Terran warship, 2 cloaked strike cruisers and the mining rights to the Helix vein. That is my bid." Silence detonated like a shockwave across the auction square. Voices froze mid-laugh, mid-sneer. The Galactic Prince's smirk withered into disbelief, then fury, then panic. Jareth's voice had not boomed or threatened. It had cut through the noise with the precision of a scalpel that exposed rot. The auctioneer stuttered, his 4 tongues trying to compute the legitimacy of such a bid. But it had to be accepted. Rules, even in barbarism, still chained the elite, and the highest bid, no matter how unexpected, always won. The prince's protest was thunderous, but Jareth ignored it as if it were dust on his coat. The Terran turned to Elsera, not with lust or victory, but with solemnity, as if she were not a possession, but a soldier rescued from an unfinished war. No words were exchanged. But when the auctioneer unlocked her chains, the first step Elsera took was not toward her former captor, but toward the human who had seen her not as property, but as a person. The path from the auction block to the warship Vigilant Mercy was paved with stunned stares and thinly veiled outrage. Nobles whispered behind their fans, holodrones spun through the air transmitting the scandal across dozens of star systems, and among it all, Elsera walked with regal grace beside the human who had disrupted an entire economy with one act of defiance. She said nothing as they approached the ship, but her stride lengthened with every step, as if reclaiming something invisible that had been taken from her long ago. Jareth offered no words either, no reassurances, no apologies. He walked ahead, not beside, giving her the space to decide whether she was following a rescuer or merely transitioning from one captor to another. And when they reached the ramp of the vessel, Jareth did something unexpected. He turned aside and let her enter first. Inside the Vigilant Mercy, there were no cages, no binding fields, no biometric restraints. The crew, a diverse array of humans and allied species, treated Elsera not with pity or fear but respect. She was guided, not dragged, to a private medbay suite where food, fresh clothes, and healing serums for her unique physiology had been prepared. Her suspicion did not fade easily. She tested the door. No lock. She searched the room, no surveillance nodes, no tethers. She expected betrayal hidden beneath kindness, expected the pain that followed every act of supposed generosity. But instead, she found a folded uniform atop the bed, her own. Cleaned, mended, with her original insignia restored by hand. That night, when Jareth visited her quarters, she stared at him not as a slave would stare at her owner, but as a soldier would assess a potential threat. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Why pay a fortune for someone everyone has forgotten?" Jareth didn't hesitate. "Because I didn't forget. I was there at Mirren Gate. I saw you hold the line when your people abandoned you, and no one who stands alone like that should ever be left to rot among monsters in gold." She didn't cry. Elsera hadn't cried in years, but she sat down slowly and whispered, "Then you're either a fool or the first man I've met who still understands what honor tastes like." To which Jareth replied, "Maybe I'm both, but you're free now, Elsera. What you do next is your choice, not mine." And then he left the room, leaving the door open behind him, like an invitation no chain could force. The Vigilant Mercy drifted through the quiet star lanes like a wolf beneath moonlight, silent but always alert, holding within its hull the weight of a decision that hadn't yet been spoken aloud. Elsera had not slept since boarding the vessel, not because of fear, but because the sensation of being unshackled after so many years had left her spirit too raw for rest. She wandered the ship's corridors in silence, barefoot, trailing her fingers across walls etched with Terran engineering, steel worn not by rust, but by touch, by stories. The crew did not stop her. Some bowed their heads as she passed, others offered gentle nods, and one or two, particularly the younger ones, looked at her with something she hadn't seen in years. Awe, not because of her beauty, because that had long been branded as grotesque by a galaxy that valued symmetry and holographic polish, but because of the unspoken truth in her gait. She had survived. Jareth had not come to speak again, and for that she was grateful. He had left her to feel her own pulse again, to decide what she was in the absence of commands and leashes. And on the third day, Elsera walked into the war room during a tactical briefing uninvited, wearing her restored armor and her war braids rewoven. The conversation stopped mid-sentence. Holograms of enemy movements flickered around the chamber, paused in frozen light. Jareth turned slowly, not surprised, but alert, attentive. "If I'm to remain," Elsera said calmly, "then I refuse to do so idle. I was general of the 7th Phalanx of the Azerad Blades. If you want my presence, you'll have my sword, or you'll have my silence." Jareth didn't answer immediately. He motioned to Lieutenant Vos to clear the room. No objections were raised. Only after the last officer had left did Jareth cross the chamber to her, remove the data disk from the command console, and hold it out to her. "Then brief me," he said, "because I think the fight that's coming might need someone who remembers what real war looks like." Elsera took the disk without hesitation. That was the moment the line between prisoner and commander began to blur. And the galaxy's scandal gave way to something far more dangerous: respect. They began working together in shifts, two shadows cast in opposite directions, who somehow learned to circle the same fire. Jareth, with his Terran instincts, strategic, raw, fueled by decades of brutal improvisation across borderless battlefields. Elsera, with her crystalline logic and the artful elegance of ancient war traditions, born from centuries of ceremonial combat and honorable slaughter. What started as strategy turned slowly into conversation. Not the surface kind, but the sort carved from bruises and loss. Stories about comrades fallen in forgotten systems, tales of betrayal by those who once called them allies, names that no longer existed but still echoed in their sleep. Elsera spoke of the night her own commanders ordered her retreat burned behind her, the way her voice had cracked when she realized the signal had been jammed. Not by the enemy, but by her own people. Jareth listened, not as a soldier, but as a man who had also tasted that same betrayal on world's earth, would never admit to visiting. When the Vigilant Mercy passed through the Andrus Gate, crossing into hostile trade space, it was Elsera who detected the ambush 2 minutes before the scanners. Jareth gave her command of the ship's inner flank. The crew didn't question it. Under her orders, the vessel slipped through a net of cloaked mines like a blade through silk, and the attackers, pirates flying outdated Vordax code, were reduced to sparks across the void. After the battle, Jareth offered her a drink, expecting her to refuse. Instead, Elsera accepted, sat across from him in the officer's mess, and drank in silence for 5 full minutes before saying, "I thought I'd forgotten how to be seen." Jareth didn't blink. "You weren't forgotten. You were buried. All I did was dig." She chuckled once, just once, but it was the kind of laugh that comes from a wound beginning to scar. Later that night, as she stood alone by the viewport, watching stars pass like slow tears across the black, Elsera whispered to her reflection, "Perhaps this time, they won't take everything from me." And somewhere in the ship's lower decks, Jareth stood beneath the hum of the core reactor, wondering when exactly his mission stopped being about a slave and became about saving someone no one else dared to love. The repairs at the Terran outpost on Varelis 3 were supposed to last only 72 hours. A routine maintenance check for the Vigilant Mercy after its evasive maneuvers through contested space. But those 3 days dragged out like a lifetime for Elsera, not because of bureaucracy or repairs, but because the station reminded her of everything she had never known: freedom, laughter, warmth without transaction. The humans there didn't look at her the way others did. No veiled disgust, no mocking awe, no fascination with her scars or the burn brands still faintly visible along her arms. Instead, children played in the hangar while engineers, old veterans, and fresh recruits moved past her, like she was simply another soul trying to find her place in the storm. And for the first time since the auction block, she didn't flinch at her reflection when it passed across polished metal. Jareth watched her from a distance. He'd grown cautious with himself around her. Not because he feared her, but because some part of him, the same part that had survived 14 campaigns and outlived 4 units, had started to believe that maybe, just maybe, Elsera wasn't someone he'd rescued. Maybe she was someone he needed. She never asked for pity. Never sought apology, and yet the way she stood on the deck, eyes closed in the wind of the atmospheric stabilizers, made it clear that she had once been starved of something deeper than food or breath. Dignity. On the second evening, the station's admiral, a crusted warhawk named Karis Drawl, invited Jareth to her office. She poured 2 glasses of fire-root brandy and spoke with the weariness of someone who had seen too many stars go dark. "You know what she is," Karis said, nodding toward the observation deck. "The Empire put a bounty on her head 3 years ago. 15 million units, dead or alive. And now she walks your deck like one of us. What's your endgame, soldier?" Jareth took the glass, but didn't drink. His voice was low, measured. "There is no endgame. I just decided not to be part of their game anymore." Karis scoffed, muttered something about fools and broken oaths, but said no more. And when Jareth left the office that night, he found Elsera already waiting for him in the engine corridor, her eyes searching his as if she knew exactly what had been spoken. Neither of them spoke. They just stood there, breathing the same air, the silence between them a kind of vow neither of them had the words for yet. They left Varellis 3 with stealth shields engaged, slipping out through a meteor belt to avoid prying eyes. Jareth knew it wouldn't last. Word travels fast, and the kind of word Elsera represented, an ex-slave of royal blood, alive and unrepentant, now standing beside a Terran officer, was not a whisper the Empire would ignore. Within 2 cycles, the first threats arrived. An encoded message from a proxy comm satellite. The seal of the Galactic Empire pulsed like a cold wound on the screen, and then came the voice, droning, detached. "Return the asset designated Elsera 07 to Imperial custody within 27 standard hours or face consequences deemed necessary." Jareth erased the message and didn't respond. Elsera had been in the war room when it arrived. She said nothing, just turned and walked out, her posture betraying nothing but her fingers twitching at her sides. Later, he found her alone in the medbay, sitting on the examination table with a cloth in her hand, scrubbing at one of her old branding marks until it bled. He stopped her by the wrist, not forcefully, just enough. "This isn't you anymore," he said. She didn't cry, didn't shout. She just said, "Then help me become something else." That night, Jareth ordered a course change, rerouting Vigilant Mercy to a hidden Terran stronghold deep in the Boreal Rift, an old listening post turned haven for displaced allies and war fugitives. The kind of place that still believed in things like oaths and redemption. It was there, under the fractured lights of a sanctuary carved into rock and memory, that Elsera stood before a council of old warriors and announced her intent. Not to flee, not to hide, but to fight. "They branded me as property," she said. "But I was born in fire, not forged in chains, and if they want to take me back, they'll have to burn everything I've become." The council voted unanimously. She would stay. She would be protected. And for the first time, Elsera didn't feel like something merely stolen or salvaged. She felt chosen, not just by the war-broken soldier who found her, but by something even rarer in the galaxy. A future. The Boreal Rift was supposed to be safe, buried beneath layers of untraceable star paths, but the galaxy was never a silent place when power had been defied. Jareth had known it the moment he caught the movement on long-range sensors, a ripple of distortion that didn't belong. Not pirates, not scavengers. Imperial bloodhounds. They were coming. And they weren't coming for war. They were coming for a statement, to erase the symbol that Elsera had become before her story could spread to others who still lived in chains. She stood on the platform above the war room, eyes locked on the hologram showing the incoming fleet. Her fingers didn't tremble anymore. She wasn't the broken thing she once was, half-starved and draped in chains. She wore real armor now. Not just metal plating, but something deeper. Purpose. Resolve. The kind of armor that makes kings hesitate before they send their wolves. Jareth climbed the steps and stood beside her. He didn't ask her to stay behind. He didn't tell her to run. He only said, if we fight together. But if we die, know this, I chose you, Elsera. Not as a mission, not as a rescue. I chose you. And in that moment, something shifted in her, not just between them, but within her very bones. The Empire had auctioned her off like meat. They'd branded her skin and paraded her body, thinking that would be her legacy. But now, in the defiant quiet before the storm, with the man who'd stood between her and oblivion, she realized the truth. She was no longer theirs to define. She had been rewritten by fire, by kindness, by defiance, and by love. The Imperial fleet didn't yet know they weren't coming to retrieve an asset. They were coming to war against something they couldn't leash. The skies above the Boreal Rift turned black with ships, but it wasn't fear that filled the stronghold below. It was silence and then preparation. Old warriors with mechanical limbs, exiles with rebel blood, and Terran engineers pulled from peace to man war posts again. And Elsera stood at the front, not behind the shields, but beside Jareth in the hangar where strike orders were issued. Her voice rang out with clarity, commanding not with rank but with something far more dangerous. Conviction. She spoke not of vengeance but of dignity, not of hatred but of belonging, and those who had never bowed to anyone found themselves nodding at her words. Not because she demanded it, but because she reminded them who they were before the galaxy made them forget. When the first wave of Imperial drones landed, they didn't fire blindly. They broadcast a message, one last insult in the form of a declaration. Surrender the slave asset Elsera 07, and all others will be spared. The name burned, not just for her, but for everyone who heard it. She didn't wait for Jareth to respond. She walked out onto the upper deck in plain view of the enemy, armor gleaming, her voice cutting through the comms with terrifying grace. I am not a number. I am not your asset. I am Elsera, and I don't belong to anyone but myself. The battle was vicious, but not chaotic. Jareth led the charge like a man possessed, a whirlwind of strategy and fury, his squadron moving like extensions of his rage and devotion. Elsera wasn't behind him, she was beside him, blade in hand, scars visible, a living symbol of what the Empire had failed to destroy. She bled, she stumbled, but she rose every time they thought she'd fall. And in those brutal hours of fire and ruin, something permanent was carved into the annals of the galaxy's memory. The story of a slave who became a warrior, and a soldier who had the courage to choose love over orders. By dawn, the wreckage of the Empire's shame littered the fields of the Rift. And as the survivors gathered, panting, burnt and bloodied, Elsera dropped to her knees, not from weakness, but to lay her palm on the earth. She whispered something Jareth couldn't hear. But later, when she looked at him with tears in her eyes and said, "You gave me back my name," he understood. They hadn't just won a battle. They had torn something ancient and cruel from its throne, and replaced it with something no empire could conquer. Word of the battle at Boreal Rift swept through the galaxy like wildfire. What was meant to be a cold message of Imperial dominance became instead a legend whispered in back alleys, mines, and ship holds. The story of a slave asset who met the storm head-on and stood with her head unbowed. Elsera's defiance and Jareth's refusal to sell her out became a rallying cry. Slaves from every system began refusing their chains, and Terran commanders reported entire outposts defecting, their banners painted with the simple sigil of a hand broken free. The Corinth Empire reeled, desperate to regain control before the contagion of hope spread further. But princes raised in palaces do not yield easily. The prince who had once sold Elsera, Vordax, summoned a conclave of enforcers and bounty hunters, swearing ruin on anyone who gave her shelter. He would break her in public this time, not just for punishment but for spectacle, to prove to the galaxy that freedom was a myth when bought by Terran hands. He dispatched a fleet to the Rim, spreading propaganda that Elsera was not a hero but a traitor, that Jareth was a pirate, and that their so-called victory at Boreal Rift was nothing but rebellion that would be stamped out before the next cycle. But Vordax misjudged the new current in the stars. He failed to see how many remembered the moment Jareth bid not for ownership, but for mercy, or how many now whispered Elsera's name as if it were a prayer. As the prince's fleet advanced on the hidden stronghold, Jareth and Elsera gathered their allies, not just soldiers, but the forgotten, the scarred, the quietly brave. The hangar was a patchwork of stolen ships and battered armor, a family built not by blood but by promise. Elsera, standing before them, wore no crown but commanded more loyalty than any royal decree. She lifted her chin, scars and all, and spoke the words that would echo in rebel hearts for centuries. You cannot chain what you cannot break. We are not here for vengeance, but for truth. Jareth watched her with the pride of a man who knew he had not only saved a life, but witnessed a destiny unfolding. The day of the prince's last gambit arrived with thunder and flame, cannons firing, shields buckling, and hope refusing to be buried. In the heart of chaos, Elsera found herself facing Vordax's flagship, its comms blaring with the cold voice of the man who once sold her. Return to chains, or see your Terran lover burn beside you. Her answer was not words, but action. She led the assault, breaking through the flagship's hull as if the entire weight of the galaxy's grief had become her sword. It took hours, but the battle was won, not with overwhelming firepower, but with unity, with desperation, with the courage to fight for something more than orders. Vordax's fleet crumbled, his flagship torn apart from within as Elsera led boarding parties to the bridge. She faced him, prince to former slave, in a throne room filled with shattered pride and the broken mirrors of an empire that had fed on humiliation. You thought buying me would erase me, she said, voice steady as stone, but you only forged my resolve. He tried to strike her, but it was Jareth who took the blow, standing between them with a shield and eyes that promised no surrender. Vordax was defeated not by force, but by the refusal of those he had scorned to hate themselves any longer. As the fires faded and the galaxy exhaled, Elsera and Jareth became more than fugitives or rebels. They became founders of something no empire could anticipate, a sanctuary called Haven's Reach, built on the ruins of the prince's pride, welcoming all who had ever been bought, broken, or betrayed. It was not paradise, not free from scars or sorrow, but it was real. In the months that followed, ships bearing the sigil of the open hand arrived one by one. Runaway slaves, war orphans, outcast soldiers, and those simply yearning to belong. Elsera stood at the heart of it all, not with chains, but with her own name, her own command, her own love. One night, beneath the ringed moons, she and Jareth stood on the balcony overlooking their new city. The air was brisk, and lights flickered below, laughter, singing, the messy, beautiful noise of life. You didn't just free me, she murmured, taking his hand. You taught me to belong. He kissed her forehead, letting his silence answer. The galaxy was still wounded, still dangerous, still full of those who would pay fortunes to own another's fate. But here, on the edge of the stars, a new legend was born. Not of slaves or soldiers, but of people who dared to stand together, to love, to hope, and to never let chains write the last line of their story.